The air in the command center felt heavier now, almost suffocating. Franklin Dawes had made his exit, his flip-flops echoing in the vast silence, but the impact of his presence still lingered like a shockwave. The officers stood motionless, frozen by the sudden shift in the narrative. The Trelzon High Marshal, usually a rock of unyielding strength, seemed for the first time unsure of himself. The power balance had just shifted, and no one knew how to deal with it. Far outside, the stars twinkled quietly above Corythi Prime, oblivious to the diplomatic dance unfolding beneath them. Franklin, however, had no such luxury. He was on a mission, and his work was only just beginning. In the small briefing room on the lower deck, Franklin sat alone at a long table, his feet propped up on the edge of a seat, his legs crossed in that unbothered way of his. A half-empty coffee cup sat to his right, the contents long gone cold. He wasn't waiting for a fight. He wasn't even waiting for a challenge. No, he was waiting for the Trelzon leadership to show their true colors, to see if they could move beyond the shell of militaristic pride they'd worn for centuries. And he had a feeling they would. The door slid open behind him, the faint sound of footsteps punctuating the silence. A figure entered, a woman, her silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. It was the officer who had spoken so harshly to him earlier, the one who had initially dismissed him. She looked different now, less rigid, more open. Her eyes were calculating, her expression unreadable. Franklin didn't turn to look at her. Instead, he took another sip from his coffee cup, still lounging in his chair. "Are you always this casual?" she asked, her tone both amused and curious. Franklin finally glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. "Why not? If I'm going to change the world, I might as well be comfortable doing it." She shook her head, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I still don't understand how you pulled that off. You came here with nothing but a corndog and a smile. How are you so sure they'll listen to you?" Franklin's gaze softened as he set the cup down and leaned forward slightly. "It's not about the corndog. It's about trust. We've all been stuck in this loop for so long, fighting and vying for power. But trust, real trust, is something that doesn't come from weapons or intimidation. It comes from listening, really listening. I can't promise we're going to fix everything overnight, but if we talk, if we understand each other, then maybe we can start something that'll actually last." The officer stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words against everything she had ever known. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders sagging just a fraction. "You make it sound so simple." "Because it is," Franklin replied, his voice light, but with a deep undertone of conviction. "You can't solve problems if you're afraid to face them." She remained silent for a moment, considering him. Then, without warning, she stepped closer, her demeanor shifting. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Kira. And I think you may be right." A brief silence passed between them before Franklin leaned back in his chair, letting his feet slip off the edge and back onto the ground. He stretched, arms raised above his head, before flashing her that familiar grin. "Well, Kira, it's a pleasure to finally meet someone who's willing to think outside the box. You know, you'd be surprised how many people think this whole peace thing is impossible." Her brow furrowed slightly. "You're different. Most humans wouldn't even try to talk to us. They'd just shoot first and ask questions later." Franklin's smile didn't falter. "Yeah, but that's not my style. I like to get to know people. Makes the whole negotiation thing easier." Kira's expression softened, and for the first time, she seemed to understand him, not just as a diplomat, but as a person. "I think you're going to shake things up, Dawes. You might even start a new chapter for the galaxy." Franklin chuckled, his eyes bright with a glimmer of excitement. "Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. But if you're ready to talk, I think it's about time we invited everyone to the table." Kira hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right. But be prepared. Not everyone in this room will be as willing to listen as I am." Franklin grinned again, a mischievous twinkle in his eye. "I'm ready. Let's get to work. Kira turned and headed toward the door, pausing just before she exited. You know, Dawes, she said with a sly smile, for a guy in flip-flops, you've got a way with making people listen. Franklin's grin widened. I told you. It's the corndog magic. As the door slid shut behind her, Franklin leaned back in his chair once more, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the tabletop. The skies above Corathi Prime were a storm of fire. Thousands of Trellzan warships, vast and unblinking, blotted out the sun as they descended in perfect formation. The city below, once a symbol of prosperity, now trembled under the shadow of impending annihilation. Explosions rocked the ground, sending waves of dust and smoke into the air. The planet's defense grids were already failing, their energy shields flickering under the constant barrage of laser fire. The evacuation had begun hours ago. Thousands of ships, from sleek civilian transports to heavy freighters, surged into the atmosphere, heading for the nearest safe zone. It was chaos, a mad scramble for survival. But no one expected this. No one expected the human envoy. In the midst of this pandemonium, a single shuttle broke through the smoke and ash, its sleek silhouette cutting through the flames as if daring them to try and stop it. The human shuttle was small, unarmed, and utterly out of place in the face of Trellzan destruction. But it wasn't the ship that captured everyone's attention. It was the man who stepped out of it. Franklin Dawes, a representative of Earth, stood at the center of the battleground, grinning like a man on vacation. His flip-flops slapped against the scorched ground with every step he took. He wore a neon Hawaiian shirt, loose and flowing, the fabric shimmering under the harsh light of the explosions. His sun-bleached hair fell carelessly over his brow, and in his right hand, he held a corndog. He chewed it casually, as if the planet wasn't in the process of being obliterated. The soldiers, mercenaries, and generals on both sides of the conflict paused, blinking in disbelief. A dozen Trellzan battle tanks rolled forward, their guns trained on the lone human. But Franklin didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to notice them. The Trellzan High Marshal, a hulking figure in gold armor, leaned forward in his command chair, narrowing his eyes. He couldn't believe it. They had been briefed on Earth's diplomats, smart, resourceful, and often unpredictable. But this was something entirely different. This was absurd. Who is this? The High Marshal growled. The comms officer hesitated before responding. Sir, this is Franklin Dawes, Terran envoy. Apparently, he's here to negotiate a peace. The High Marshal scoffed. A peace, with a corndog. He barked an order to fire. The tanks opened fire in unison, their cannons unleashing a brutal volley of energy blasts toward the man standing in the middle of it all. But just as the first blast whizzed through the air, something strange happened. A shimmering barrier materialized around Dawes, a field of light that swallowed the shot whole. Franklin, still chewing his corndog, looked around as if considering his options. The shields held. He took another bite. Another volley came, and again, the shield absorbed it without a single crack. He finished the corndog and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, unfazed. Yeah, he said aloud, his voice carrying easily across the battlefield. I'm pretty sure this wasn't covered in the briefing. He tapped a small device on his wrist, and a smooth, almost cheerful voice echoed from his wristband. Deb, activate Protocol Omega. The sky above shimmered, and a ripple of energy spread out, cascading from Dawes' position, and radiating outward like a shockwave. In moments, the Trellzan tanks went dark, their weapons powered down as if someone had flipped a switch. The soldiers inside cursed in their alien tongues, scrambling to regain control. Franklin didn't seem to care. He walked toward the nearest Trellzan officer, still smiling like he was at a beach party. He raised an eyebrow. You guys got a snack bar around here? He asked. The briefing room was quieter now, the tension from moments ago slowly dissipating into the stale air. The Trellzan officers, the once proud warriors who had so confidently surrounded the galaxy with their might, now sat in a different silence, one of contemplation, of doubt, and for some, reluctant acceptance. Franklin Dawes stood at the edge of the room, his arms folded casually across his chest, eyes scanning the faces around him. The High Marshal, who had once seemed unmovable, now looked like a man holding a fragile thread, unsure if it would snap or hold steady. Franklin wasn't about to let the moment pass. He knew that words were important, but actions were what truly sealed the deal. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, the weight of 1,000 years of conflict, and yet there was an undeniable spark of something new in the air. For the first time, the galaxy had taken a collective breath, and it was as if the stars themselves had paused to listen. "We're not out of the woods yet," Franklin said, his voice cutting through the silence with a quiet determination. "But we've made it this far. The hard part isn't getting to the table, it's staying there." The High Marshal shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he watched Franklin. "And what makes you think this will work, human?" "A truce, yes, but what happens when someone tests it? What happens when another faction decides to break the peace?" Franklin's smile was slow, but confident. "Well, that's the thing about peace. It's not about never having conflict. It's about how you handle it when it comes. We're not here to pretend the universe will suddenly become a utopia. But if we all agree to stand together, to protect this moment we've carved out, then when the storm hits, we'll face it together." There was a murmur of agreement from some of the officers, but not everyone was convinced. Franklin noticed the dissent in their eyes, the uncertainty that still clung to the air. It was understandable. Peace was a fragile thing, especially when it was built on such a turbulent history. But Franklin had always been a betting man, and this was a gamble worth taking. The door slid open, breaking the silence, and Kira stepped in. Her silver hair gleamed like moonlight, and her gaze was sharp, but there was something different in the way she carried herself. Something softer, more open. She met Franklin's eyes, a subtle nod of acknowledgement passing between them. "Things are moving," Kira said quietly. "The Compact has agreed to hear our proposal. The first steps toward a true diplomatic council will begin." Franklin raised an eyebrow, his expression one of pleasant surprise. "Already?" She nodded. "There are still plenty of naysayers, of course, but the majority. They see the potential. They see what you've built here." Franklin's gaze shifted back to the High Marshal. The man was still stone-faced, but Franklin could tell that something had shifted in him too. It wasn't a total victory, not yet, but the ground was being laid for something monumental. "What happens now?" the High Marshal asked, his voice quieter than before. Franklin exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment sinking in. "Now we keep pushing forward. We keep the dialogue open, even when it's hard. There will be more battles. Not all of them will be easy, but every step we take together makes the next one easier. We'll build something lasting, something strong, together." A long silence followed, but this time, it was a silence of agreement, not of uncertainty. The officers around the table, the military leaders, the diplomats, they all understood. It wasn't a simple solution. It wouldn't happen overnight. But they had a chance now, a chance to change the narrative, to rewrite history. Finally, the High Marshal stood, his towering figure casting a shadow over the table. He looked down at Franklin, a quiet acknowledgement in his gaze. "You may be right," the Marshal said, his voice surprisingly soft. "Perhaps it's time to try something new." Franklin smiled, his expression filled with a quiet satisfaction. "It's not just about trying, Marshal. It's about doing. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, but I think we're up to it." As Franklin walked toward the door, he felt a sense of hope stirred deep within him. The galaxy was on the cusp of something unprecedented, and for the first time in a long while, the stars above didn't seem so distant. They seemed within reach. When Franklin stepped outside, the cool night air of Corythi Prime greeted him. The sky was clear, the stars twinkling like a million promises. And in that moment he knew he wasn't just a man in flip-flops. He was a man with a mission. And the galaxy. The galaxy was ready for something new. The future had begun. The tension in the room was like the stillness before a storm. But this time, it was different. Franklin Dawes sat at the head of a long, sleek conference table, surrounded by Trellsan leaders, military officials, and representatives from various sectors of the Galactic Compact. The walls of the chamber hummed softly, a reminder of the power they could unleash if things went south. But for now, there was an uneasy peace, an unspoken understanding that for once, the weapons were put away, and the conversation would be the weapon of choice. Franklin adjusted his Hawaiian shirt and kicked his feet up onto the table, his flip-flops dangling from his toes as he casually surveyed the room. It was a gathering of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, and yet here he was, unarmed, relaxed, and entirely unbothered by the gravity of the situation. If anything, he seemed to be enjoying it. Across from him sat the High Marshal, his gold armor gleaming even under the dim lights of the room. The Trellsan military leader had an aura of unshakable authority, yet his eyes betrayed a deep unease. His knuckles were clenched, though his hands rested on the table in front of him, as if holding himself back from something more primal. Franklin could sense it, the tension under the surface. The Marshal knew what was at stake, and he didn't like how things were unfolding. "So, we're doing this?" Franklin asked with a grin, glancing around the table. "Really thought you'd try to ambush me with a fleet or something. Guess the whole talking it out thing is starting to catch on, huh?" The officers seated beside the Marshal exchanged uneasy looks, their fingers twitching near their weapons. Kira, the silver-haired officer, was standing to the side, arms crossed, observing everything with a sharp eye. She seemed calmer than most, but even she couldn't shake the underlying tension. The Marshal cleared his throat, his voice a deep rumble. "This is not how we do things, human. You've set a precedent that cannot be ignored. But I'm here because I'm willing to listen." Franklin tilted his head slightly, the grin never leaving his face. "Oh, I'm not asking you to ignore it. I'm asking you to adapt to it." He leaned forward, his tone growing more serious. "You see, the old way, war, conquest, fear, it's not going to work anymore. And not just for you. For everyone." The High Marshal's eyes narrowed, but Franklin continued, undeterred. "You've been in power for a long time, Marshal. I get it. You've ruled with strength, with fear. But strength without cooperation is just destruction. And trust me, no one wins that way, not for long." He looked around the room, letting his words sink in. "The old system is broken, and I'm offering you a new one. A system where power isn't wielded by force, but by understanding. Where we share our resources, our knowledge, and our goals, not as conquerors, but as allies." The room was still. Even the officers who had been so eager to draw weapons moments ago were now frozen in place. Franklin had this way of cutting through the noise, of making it all seem so simple. And maybe, just maybe it was. The Marshal glanced at Kira, as if seeking some kind of guidance, but she remained silent, her gaze unwavering. She was watching Franklin carefully, as though waiting for him to make some fatal mistake. But Franklin didn't flinch. He was standing firm, confident that his words were making a dent in their ironclad minds. Finally, the High Marshal spoke, his voice gruff but thoughtful. "And if we refuse this new world you speak of?" Franklin's smile faltered for a brief moment, and for the first time, he seemed to consider the weight of his words. "Then we go back to the old ways, Marshal, and we all know where that leads." He let the silence stretch out between them. For a heartbeat, it seemed like the universe was holding its breath. Then the Marshal sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the tabletop. "I will take your proposal to the Council," he said slowly. "But know this, human, this will not be easy. There are forces in the galaxy that will never accept peace. Then we deal with them," Franklin said, his voice unwavering. "But we deal with them together, all of us. Earth, the Trellsan, the Compact. If we don't stand united, we'll fall divided. That's the way it's always been. And I'm betting that's the way it'll always be, no matter what. He stood up, pushing his chair back with a soft scrape. So, what's it going to be? You take the peace offer, or you throw it out the window and go back to the battlefield. The marshal stared at him, his gaze hard but no longer filled with animosity. Franklin's words had struck a chord, though whether it was out of respect or fear, no one could say. The room waited. The fate of the galaxy seemed to hang in the balance, suspended in that single, unspoken moment. And then, the marshal nodded. Very well. We'll give peace a chance. The battlefield had fallen into an uneasy silence. The air was thick with smoke and the faint smell of burning ozone. Soldiers from both sides stood frozen, eyes wide, staring at the lone human who had just casually stopped a barrage of artillery with nothing more than a shield and a smile. Franklin Dawes stood in the middle of the devastation, hands on his hips, feet planted firmly in his flip-flops. He took in a deep breath of the acrid air, looked at the Trellzan soldiers, and shrugged, unfazed. A distant rumble of more incoming fire echoed across the city. But for now, everything was still. Everyone was waiting. The Trellzan High Marshal's voice crackled over the comms, laced with disbelief and anger. What is this? Franklin casually flicked his wrist, and the shield surrounding him hummed, a soft glow emanating from the edges like a protective aura. Name's Frankie Dawes, Terran diplomat. Not exactly what you were expecting, huh? He gestured to his Hawaiian shirt and flip-flops, the image of a man who had wandered into a war zone on a casual stroll. A few Trellzan officers who hadn't quite processed what was happening began murmuring to each other. This was absurd, impossible. And yet, here it was. One man, no weapons, standing in the middle of what should have been a battlefield. And he was smiling. Franklin didn't seem to care about the confusion he caused. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, having finished off his corn dog, and tossed the stick into the air. As it spun, the stick suddenly disintegrated in a small burst of energy, the last remnants of the nanotech beacon inside it having activated. Deb, his AI companion, chimed in from his wristband. Just confirming, Franklin. The beacon is now fully embedded in the Trellzan fleet's command systems. Their chain of command is now legally obligated to engage in peace talks. Great, Franklin said, casually brushing off a speck of dust from his shirt. Now we just need them to stop shooting at me long enough to chat. As if on cue, the Trellzan tanks powered up again. But this time, Franklin didn't even flinch. Instead, he lazily tapped a button on his wristband, and almost as if by magic, the massive war machines froze mid-movement. Their cannons aimed, but the turrets refused to fire. Their shields hummed to life, but then sputtered out. It was as if they'd been turned off, just like that. The soldiers inside scrambled, yelling at each other, desperately trying to regain control of their systems. But Franklin was already walking toward the nearest tank, his flip-flops making soft slapping sounds against the cracked pavement as he approached the massive war machine. He stopped in front of it and looked up at the towering machine, hands still in his pockets. "So, you guys like to fight, huh?" he said, his voice carrying easily across the open space. "You know, I was expecting a little more oomph from an alien war machine. Maybe next time." The crew inside the tank scrambled to open the hatch, but Franklin was quicker. With a single motion, he reached up and pressed a button on the tank's exterior. The hatch opened, and the Trellzan soldiers inside stared at him, dumbfounded. He waved, still smiling. "You guys got anything to eat? Or, maybe some shade? My flip-flops are burning on this hot concrete." The soldiers looked at each other, utterly confused. This was supposed to be the moment when they crushed the Terran diplomat. Instead, it felt like they were being made part of some bizarre performance. They had just witnessed a single man, in flip-flops no less, disarm their entire fleet without firing a shot, and now he was asking for snacks. One of the soldiers, a young Trellzan who had been with the fleet for only a few months, slowly raised his rifle. But before he could even aim, Franklin snapped his fingers, and the weapon flew out of his hands, caught by an invisible force field. "Nice try," Franklin said, tossing the rifle aside with a casual flick of his wrist. "Now, anyone else feeling hungry?" The young soldier just stared at him, speechless. Franklin gave him a friendly wink, turned around, and walked back toward the center of the battlefield. His flip-flops made their soft, slapping sound as he went. Behind him, the Trelzan soldiers stood motionless, still processing what had just happened. For the first time, a ripple of uncertainty passed through their ranks. This wasn't just a human diplomat. This was something else entirely. Franklin Dawes, Terran Envoy, had just set the stage for a peace that no one had expected, and the galaxy wasn't sure if it was ready for it. The battlefield had gone eerily still. The Trelzan tanks, once roaring with destructive fury, now stood silent and harmless, their weapons locked in place. The soldiers inside their metal behemoths still stared at the human diplomat in disbelief. Franklin Dawes, still in his neon Hawaiian shirt and flip-flops, casually strolled through the ranks of alien war machines as if they were a mild inconvenience. His ever-present corndog was gone, discarded moments ago, but the faint aroma of its batter lingered in the air. He paused in front of a group of Trelzan officers who had gathered near the command center. They were standing in tight formation, their faces locked in stern expressions, each one unsure of what to do with the human who had just single-handedly neutralized their assault. Franklin didn't seem bothered by their silence. In fact, he looked positively relaxed. He tilted his head back and stretched, reaching into his pocket for another snack. The officers exchanged confused glances. "Can I help you with something?" Franklin asked, his voice cheerful, almost casual. His flip-flops slapped against the cracked ground as he stepped closer, clearly unafraid. His smile remained wide and easy, but there was an unmistakable gleam of purpose behind his relaxed demeanor. A tall officer, his uniform adorned with gold insignia, finally spoke up. His voice was deep, rough, tinged with frustration. "Human, this is not a place for jokes. You have interfered with a military operation of the Trelzan Dominion. The war is already decided." Franklin raised an eyebrow, his mouth twitching into a grin. "Yeah, about that. I'm afraid that's a little outdated. You see, I'm here to end the war. And trust me, we're going to make this so much more fun than just some big, ugly battle." He tapped a button on his wristband. In an instant, a holographic projection flared to life in the center of the group, a 3D image of the Trelzan fleet. The ships hung in space, their massive forms cast in stark relief against the backdrop of distant stars. "You've got a real nice setup here," Franklin continued, looking up at the projection. "I mean, I can't even imagine how much it costs to run all of this. It's impressive for sure. But here's the thing." He leaned in, his voice lowering as if sharing a secret. "This little light show, it doesn't scare me. In fact, I'm not scared of any of it." The officer's eyes narrowed. One of them, a woman with short silver hair, stepped forward, her stance defensive. "And what makes you think you have the power to stop us?" Franklin glanced at her, his expression unchanged. "Oh, it's not about power. It's about diplomacy." He gestured to the now dominant projection of the fleet. "See, I've just activated a little legal quirk in the Galactic Compact. A rule, really. Any military force that engages in a full-scale attack on a planet under diplomatic negotiation automatically triggers mandatory peace talks. You guys are technically bound by law now to negotiate with Earth. And well, here I am, all set to talk." He smiled and motioned to the air around him. "And, you know, while we're at it, maybe I could grab a drink or two. It's going to be a long day." The officers stood frozen. A few of them exchanged uncertain glances, but no one spoke. Franklin let the silence hang for a moment, then leaned in, lowering his voice for added effect. "You don't really want to fight this battle," he said. "At least, not the way you think. If you start shooting again, you'll just be breaking laws, And that's going to make this whole thing messier than it needs to be. What's the point in all that? You can still save face, you know. You've got a chance to walk away. And, well, I'm not even asking for anything big. Just a little chat. There was a long pause. Then, just as Franklin began to think they might ignore him entirely, the silver-haired officer spoke again. "You are a strange human," she said, her tone still laced with suspicion, but something else too, something like reluctant curiosity. "What is your real purpose here?" Franklin smiled even wider, leaning back slightly as if savoring the moment. "Well, if you're asking about me personally, I'm just a guy with a corn dog and a knack for getting people to talk. And trust me, once we sit down and chat, you're going to be really glad you took me seriously." He winked at her, then looked around at the stunned officers, his posture easy and completely unthreatened. "So, what's it gonna be? Peace talks? Or do we keep doing this song and dance?" For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty passed through the officer's eyes. She glanced at her comrades, who exchanged looks of their own. Something had shifted in the air, whether it was Franklin's words, his calm, or the unspoken tension that hung between the enemy forces. No one could say. But it was clear that the trajectory of the war was about to change. The tension in the command center was palpable. Franklin Dawes had only just stepped inside, his flip-flops slapping lightly on the polished metal floors as he strolled past the rows of Trelzan officers, all of whom had given up trying to decipher him. The room was a hive of frantic activity. Blinking screens, urgent conversations, and the soft hum of an alien shipyard being run under intense pressure. Yet, amid the chaos, Franklin's presence was like a calm breeze, unshaken by the whirlwind around him. He wasn't supposed to be here. None of this was supposed to happen this way. But the High Marshal's orders had been clear. If Franklin Dawes made it this far, they would have to listen. Now Franklin was on the cusp of negotiating a peace, but it wasn't just for Corathi Prime. It was for the entire galaxy. A new order was beginning to form, and Earth was at the center of it all. A door slid open at the far end of the room. The officer from earlier, the one with the silver hair, entered with the High Marshal in tow. He was a massive figure, his gold-plated armor gleaming even in the dim lighting of the command center. His eyes locked onto Franklin with cold intensity, but even he seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second as Franklin flashed a grin. Well, Franklin said, casually leaning against a console. "It's nice of you to join me. I was just admiring your decor. Very sleek, very military." The High Marshal's gaze never wavered, but there was a subtle twitch at the corner of his mouth, betraying a flicker of annoyance. He stepped forward, his voice deep and commanding. "You've disrupted everything, human. You've stopped a war you had no right to intervene in." Franklin shrugged, unfazed. "I've done more than stop a war. I've stopped a bloody war. You're welcome, by the way." A heavy silence followed, the air thick with unspoken threats. Franklin didn't move, didn't flinch. He was here to play a game, and his entire being said he was willing to go all in. The High Marshal stood inches away, towering over him, but for all his height and armor, he couldn't intimidate the diplomat who seemed so out of place in the midst of this galactic power struggle. "So," Franklin continued, popping a mint into his mouth, "how about we get down to business? You can keep threatening me, or we can talk. You're the one who's been launching firepower across this planet. I'm just here to fix the mess. So, what's it going to be?" The High Marshal's expression tightened, but the silver-haired officer stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "Enough. We'll hear you out, Dawes. But know this, the Trelzan Dominion will never submit to your demands. Not under the threat of law. Not under any circumstances." Franklin smiled wider, the kind of grin that suggested he had just won a private joke. "Oh, I'm not here to make you submit. Not at all. I'm here for something much bigger. You see, I'm not asking you to kneel to Earth. I'm asking you to step into a world where you don't have to fight for everything." The High Marshal's brow furrowed. "What world is that?" A world where you don't have to point weapons at every star you see, Franklin said with a shrug. A world where resources are shared, where power isn't everything. A world where peace is the goal. I know, sounds crazy, right? But trust me, it's way better than endless war. The room was quiet. The officers exchanged looks, unsure of how to respond. It was clear that Franklin wasn't just a diplomat. He was a visionary, and whether they liked it or not, his words were getting through. The High Marshal's eyes narrowed as he studied the Terran in front of him. You speak of ideals, but this is the real world. You can't just erase the power struggles of 1,000 years. Franklin chuckled softly. And you're right. I can't. But if we don't try, then the power struggles will never stop. He straightened up, suddenly serious. It's time for the galaxy to look at Earth. You've all seen what we can do with nothing but a corndog and a couple of tricks up our sleeves. Imagine what we could do with real cooperation. The High Marshal didn't say anything for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Franklin. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. We will consider your proposal. Franklin's smile returned, even wider than before. That's all I can ask for. He turned on his heel, heading toward the door. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to find something to eat. I'm starving. The High Marshal watched him go, his mind racing with what had just happened. Franklin Dawes had come in with nothing but a corndog, a grin and a proposal, and now the entire galactic order was shifting. What had been a war was becoming a conversation, and whether they liked it or not, the game had changed. The question now was, what would the galaxy do next? The hum of tension hung heavy in the air. The once confident Trelzan officers stood in an awkward circle around Franklin Dawes, their faces shifting from confusion to suspicion. The war machines that had only moments ago been poised to obliterate Corithy Prime now stood dormant, their deadly power stifled by the flicker of legalese. Franklin stood in the center, his posture as relaxed as ever, hands casually tucked into his Hawaiian shirt pockets, his flip-flops barely making a sound against the cracked concrete. The battlefield had gone quiet, the only noise the faint whir of the nearby command center's cooling vents. It was as if time had frozen. So, you're telling me, one of the officers said, her voice cold but tinged with the weight of disbelief, that because you sent us a corndog with a nanotech beacon inside, we are legally obligated to talk peace. She looked at him as though he were some ridiculous creature, as if the very idea of diplomacy in this manner was absurd. What kind of game are you playing, human? Franklin shrugged, a lazy grin spreading across his face. Game? Nah. No games here. Just a little old Terran tradition. And you'd be surprised how often food comes in handy in negotiations. He glanced down at his flip-flops. You know, food and sandals. Classic combo. Works every time. A silence settled over the group, thick and uncomfortable. The Trelzan officer's gaze flickered to the ground, and her fingers twitched as if she might reach for her weapon, but stopped herself. There was something different in Franklin's eyes, something that wasn't like any human they'd encountered before. This wasn't arrogance. This wasn't fear. This was confidence. The sort of confidence that seemed to diffuse any threat simply by existing. Behind the officers, a distant rumble echoed as a Trelzan warship shifted into low orbit, its massive engines shaking the atmosphere with each tremor. The sound made the ground beneath their feet tremble, and it was enough to snap the officer back to reality. She stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. You have disrupted an entire military operation. We could have flattened this planet by now. But instead, you? She stopped herself, realizing how weak her words sounded. There was no pride in this argument. No truth to it anymore. Franklin cut her off with a wave of his hand. Yeah, I know. I messed up your plan. But hey, I didn't even bring the big guns. Didn't even need to. All I did was make a little snack, flip the switch, and boom, your fleet's locked in a peace treaty. No war, no casualties. He paused, looking around, then cocked his head as if considering something. You know what's the best part? I didn't even have to break a sweat. He grinned wider. Now that's efficiency. The officer's mouth twitched, and for a moment, Franklin thought she might laugh. But instead, she spun on her heel, walking briskly toward the command center. The other officers exchanged glances, unsure what to do next. Franklin had caught them off guard. No one had ever seen a human act like this, so unbothered by the scale of the situation, so unaffected by the overwhelming power of their enemies. As the officer entered the command center, Franklin turned his attention to the horizon, where the battle had once raged. Now, the planet seemed peaceful in the wake of the conflict, though he knew it was only the calm before the storm. But he felt something stirring deep in his chest, a strange but powerful certainty. This wasn't just about stopping one war. This was about something bigger. "Hey, Deb," he muttered under his breath, tapping the wristband on his arm. "What's the status on that peace talk setup?" Deb's voice came through the earpiece with her usual deadpan tone. "Set to begin within the hour. Invitations are being sent out to the compact assembly. I've also requested seating for you and Princess Ishani, per your earlier instructions." "Good." Franklin gave a half-smile, rolling his shoulders as if he were preparing for a long meeting. "Let's make sure they know this isn't a negotiation for just this planet. We're changing the game here." Meanwhile, inside the command center, the officer who had questioned him earlier stood before the Trelzen High Marshal, her expression conflicted. She spoke in quick, hushed tones. The Marshal listened intently, his once imposing stature now seeming slightly smaller under the weight of Franklin's unexpected victory. The Trelzen military might have been able to crush Korathi Prime, but one man, one human, had just flipped their entire operation upside down. Far above, in the stars, the other worlds of the Galactic Compact watched. Uncertain, hesitant, but now, more than ever, wondering, what exactly was Earth, and what kind of force had just entered their domain? And Franklin Dawes, standing there with his hands still in his pockets, his flip-flops gently tapping.